live. Welcome to another episode of Comp and Coffee. Very excited to be here today with Bill, Matt, Ruth, and of course myself, Russ here. And I have to just, the elephant in the room is really the title of this episode, which is the top 3 ways you can tell if employees are researching their own compensation. And you won't believe number 2. So I'd love to kind of talk about that today. And I think we have to get to number 2 pretty quick, because you can't like bait and switch people. You can't like lure them in to an episode and then just like switch out the topic. So, just as sort of an icebreaker here, sort of, is this, Ruth, let's start with you on this sort of topic. Like when you think about, the difficult conversation of, and you've been going through the interview process, and or let's say it's a new hire, or maybe it's an existing employee who's been going out there. How often when you think about that difficult conversation and sort of the challenges you might run into with the difficult conversation, how often is that compensation part of that story, part of that difficult conversation for you in your experience?
I think often it's historically been left to the latter part of the acquisition process. We go through vetting the person, and then pay was often left till last. I think that's definitely changed when we're going to talk much more about kind of the availability of data to candidates, to employees now. They have much more access to data, so most of them come a little more informed to those discussions, and that may come up earlier. So we're definitely seeing that shift in how them preparing themselves more for the pay conversation as well as the kind of screening conversation.
Right. So you're kind of expecting the employee to come prepared for the compensation conversation, more equipped than they'd have in the past.
Ideally, yeah.
Yeah. Bill, what are your thoughts on that? What do you think you see when you get that difficult conversation happening? Is it around compensation typically? And how do you sort of prepare yourself for that conversation?
It is often about compensation, especially now because of like everything that's going on in the economy. Employees are hearing from their friends and neighbors, and the person at the desk next door, I just got an offer or just had a headhunter call. And so people are there. The word travels fast when there's, the grass is greener and people start looking, and that is usually the driver, or I won't say usually, often the driver or a driver in people's decision to look and or leave their current role for another one, even, dare I say, internally. And the internal transfers, often come with a bump. So, that's part of it. Whether or not that's always the true reason is unclear, but it's, most people work to earn a living. And if you can earn a better living, people will at least consider it and, often migrate to it.
Yeah, exactly. And Matt, sort of the same question a little bit, but, when you run into these conversations and it is about compensation a little bit, how do you kind of get the feeling of like these guys are really researching what their compensation should be, or at least what they think it should be? And where do you think they're going for this sort of source of data? Like, what do you think the go-to place for employees is to kind of come armed with the right information to have that conversation?
Yeah, I mean, when I think back to 5, even 10 years ago, managing folks, there wasn't as much data available. So to answer your question on where they're going, there is a lot of places on the internet that they can go to, places like Glassdoor, where they can go and search for their jobs and find some salary figure that they could attach to their position. The other thing that I was thinking of, how it sort of changed when Ruth and Bill were talking, I was listening, but I was also thinking about what I was going to say next. That's usually how it goes. I was thinking, what else has changed a lot is how much people are talking internally, like Bill talked about internal moves. I think that people share salary information more with their peers than they ever did before. I couldn't imagine, when I started out talking with my peers, someone sitting next to me about how much I'm making, what my base salary is, what I'm getting for, if it was like a commission job, what my bonus was, that sort of stuff. I feel like it wasn't talked about, and it's talked about a lot more, which is, a good thing. But it's something that as a manager, you need to be prepared for that, expect that they've been talking to their peers. And if there are other people in the role that they're in, if it's an internal move, something like that, or someone coming looking for a raise, they're going to know what some of their other peers are making within the same job, and you need to be prepared for those types of questions and talking about performance and skill sets and all of that sort of stuff.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. Definitely the trend of pay transparency and pay equity, particularly in the mid-teens, 2013, 2014, 2015, women in particular being coached, talk about your salary. It's the only way you're going to understand. And I think that's sort of permeated throughout the culture, particularly with younger employees. One other thing I want to ask you guys before we start diving a little deeper on the types of data and how we as comp professionals can sort of respond responsibly to this and handle some of the objection handling that our employees will have around their sort of data. Do you think, what do you think of market trends impacting the employee's desire to do research? So for example, when you hear the news talking about record inflation and salaries not keeping up with inflation, do you think this sort of triggers employees to go out and proactively do that research? Or is sort of the media and just the environment, the economic environment sort of causing that sort of stuff? Ruth, I see you nodding over there.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think, the last 12 months, we've seen so many employees, as part of the great evaluation, rethinking their careers and seeing that, moving on for reasons of, just wanting to do something different after the period of reflection that they had during the pandemic phase. But also, seeing that the kind of the pay increases that people were getting moving on. We've had a period of 10 years of pretty much 3% increases every year. And at that time, if to get any more than 3%, you literally had to move jobs, but there weren't many jobs to move to. Whereas now, there's obviously labor shortages, skill shortages, and people are, moving and getting, significant increases as a result of that. So.
Yeah, got it. So people are doing the research. To Matt's point, there's more research. Bill, did you have anything you wanted to add there before I move on to my next question?
Does my face show that I do?
It does. We turned video on today for the listeners. I know you don't see the video, but I'm actually liking the video now because I can see the various visual cues as to know
the reactions.
Yeah.
Wow. So what I think is funny is, and probably the reason I was smiling when Ruth was talking is back in the early 2000s, I think there was a lot more media, what I guess I would call active promotion of the idea of evaluating your own salary versus the market. And I think part of that was just sort of everyone getting used to the internet, and the fact that this information is available. And so back then it would be like, have you checked the value of your job? What are you worth? Knowing, understanding that and understanding that information was for a first time easily available to most people for most jobs. Now you don't see those kinds of stories, but you see stories about jobs, values of jobs going up or, demand for jobs increasing. And so people now understand that when they hear those stories, they can actually go look on their own and get a pretty quick answer. And, in this sort of an ironic way, often do it on their work computer while they're sitting at the desk, on a Zoom call, like look up
like Bill's doing right now.
No, I was reading the news, but anyway, just kidding. But I did, people are looking and I think that there are these triggering events and when they talk to their coworkers, the coworkers are generally telling the truth. So they're understanding what the data is and, what the real market is for their job. And I assume we're going to get into the difference between the market for the job and the market for a given person in the job. But, they're, I guess, at an entry level doing comp work.
Yeah.
I think it's back to, first step toward transparency.
Yeah.
I think one other thing in the media too, we talked about inflation and hearing that, and that could be something that triggers them to then start looking, but also, the job reports are coming out. The July BLS job report had that. I think we regained back in the U.S. all of the jobs that were lost during COVID. So there's supply out there as well for positions for them. I think when you hear that, you hear inflation, you talk to your peers and hear that they're getting more money, then it's natural that you're going to go start looking around.
Yeah.
I mean, there's still 2 candidates for every job or something. So it's still a, candidates market. So.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
It still feels
2
like,
jobs
even though,
for every candidate, whichever way around it is. Yeah.
yeah, it's fascinating because you have this recession talk,
It's
but
that
you also
one.
have this like record employment, like everybody's
Yes.
if you want a job, you
Yeah.
can find it sort of thing, which is
Yeah.
just really, really interesting. So we all talked about, so there's all these market pressures or market incentivizers for people to do the research. We know there's a culture shift where people are now talking about their compensation more. We know, as Bill pointed out, there's been a data availability, right, of all kinds of, self-research salary data. But like we've been learning around politics for the past 4 years, just because it's on the internet doesn't necessarily mean it's true. So is it a good thing that people are out there researching their own salary and coming to us as comp professionals, comp practitioners, and saying, hey, I know what I'm worth. Why am I not being paid this number? Let's go to Bill. Bill, why is it good? Is it good and healthy that people are going out there doing this research and coming to us with this stuff?
Absolutely. It's good in that people are doing research and learning, how markets work, what the value for jobs is, how it changes. And I think that comp people should be open to those discussions, and line managers. I think we all find that challenging because it's not usually, hey, let's, or maybe the ones that are burned in our minds aren't the, friendly collaborative employee who comes in and says, hey, I was doing some research and I'm curious as to, why my research doesn't match whatever your research is, because obviously you, Mr. or Ms. company person, are doing lots of research before you set my pay. It's the ones that we remember, the people that come in guns a-blazing, and you're taking advantage of me and I'm, 10% under market and I've done the research and I know I'm being cheated. And those people, it's hard to calm down. And that's the conversation that we don't like to have. But in general, the idea that people are doing research is good, and sort of the conversation, I think, is critical between either, comp person and employee or manager and employee to explain, how we as a company do this, what we look at, and I've been seeing this for, 20 years. And one of the things that I think is important for the employees to understand is there's a lot that goes into this. We're not just, as employers trying to get the most value out of an employee for the least money possible. We're trying to pay people fairly, but we're looking at a lot of different things, and there are a lot of nuances to the job. There are a lot of nuances to the skills in that job and how you match that. And there are a lot of things that people, mistake for, things they should get paid for, and that is often, or the easiest category to see is when people have skills that are not necessary or highly valuable for the job they're doing. Just because you have a skill doesn't mean we as an employer should pay you for it. And maybe you're in the wrong job if you have some super valuable skill that I'm telling you is not valuable for what you're doing today. But that's often where it is. And I think the other sort of disconnect is people implicitly give themselves promotions when they're looking at market data. They think that they are more senior, they have more authority, more autonomy, more control, more responsibility, better performance than they do, or at least than their manager or their company thinks that they do. So
isn't that also reflective of the, not all data that's available for employees is the same?
Correct.
The assumption that there's one source of data and the data source that I'm using, but crowdsourced data is definitely on the rise. I mean, it's something that we've been doing for a long time, here at PayScale with our employee resource data, but we're seeing much more different types of crowdsourced providers coming into the market, Bill, aren't we?
Yes, and I think it's important to know what those sources are, because that's what our employees are seeing, and also know the strengths and weaknesses of them. And they're, coming from different places. There's, crowdsourced, employee source data. There's data that's scraped off of job postings. There's, anecdotal data. There's, data provided by other companies, by recruiters. There are a lot of different sources for the data, and they all have value to people. And as employers, I think there's a lot of value in knowing what's out there, because because that's what your employees are seeing, and whether it's right or wrong, that's their starting point. And you need to connect. You need to basically close the gap between what we see as the value of the job and what the employee sees. And and often the employee sees the biggest number they can find. That's to them that's the most credible source, which I would do too.
So great points. All so much in there to think about. And so Matt, when you hear Bill talk about things like it's and Ruth too, understanding the kind of the source of the data. Are you leveling yourself properly when you're looking at the data? As a manager, and when someone comes into you and sort of is armed in this way, how do you start to, how does that conversation, how do you think that conversation should go between either the comp professional or the manager or the hiring manager or the current manager of the employee / candidate and that individual who thinks they've got, just the best data possible? How do you start to educate that person? How does that conversation start, Matt?
I mean, I think you need to work together on it and talking through the source of the data, taking a look at the job description. Bill mentioned people giving themselves promotions when they're looking at jobs, and it's matching up with the existing job description. So having a good job description for your position, for the person that's coming to that call, that meeting, is a great foundation to start with, and compare that with the other position. And, talking through that, as well as where their skill set is today, where their performance is today. And then, as a comp professional, talking through the different pros and cons of the types of data that they're bringing to them. It's not an outright rejection of what they're bringing to you, because again, going back, this is their expectation of where they should be paid. It's a competitive job market. There are other organizations that are looking at this same type of data too. So you need to expect that, the other compensation manager, HR manager that's at a company nearby, they may be looking at that same data that an employee brought to you as well too. So there's a good chance that person could go somewhere else and get what they're expecting there. So it's understanding, the job description, the source of the data. I think having budget conversations as well in those sort of situations, and not helping the employee understand when you can do increases and why we set aside times typically throughout the year when we can do increases, that we can't do one-offs whenever someone comes to us, and working on a plan towards getting to that number. Whether it's they need to add on additional skills, they need to work towards a promotion, or frankly, it is merited, but we just need to wait for that process to take place at some point in the year.
Yeah, I think that's a great approach. And one of the things I was thinking about as you were talking about that, and all the other comments you made, if I'm a comp professional, right, I do have a lot of insights into how jobs are priced and how they're leveled. And I can almost imagine, having access to a tool that could give an employee reported data as well as other forms of salary data, and being able to sort of spin it around with that employee and say, well, look, if I price the job the way you priced it, I too get the number you want. But let's talk a little bit more about the actual role you're applying for. And if we assume a couple less of years of experience, or they remove the MBA requirement, all of a sudden it drops down 20% from what you're asking for. So let's try to figure out where we really are, because the data can show both things, right? Because we know even in all these online tools, a few tweaks here and there, and those numbers can move radically, right? And so it's really making sure we're set on that. But it's easier for us as comp professionals. But, as we learned in CBPR, right, our comp best practices report, a lot of time these conversations are happening between the frontline manager and the employee. Maybe that frontline manager is not as well versed in all the things we just discussed. Ruth, how do you go about arming these managers? How do you enable them to have that conversation? What can we do as practitioners to help them be ready for these discussions?
Yeah, you mentioned the CBPR, Russ. It was, I think, 54% of respondents this year in the 2022 survey said that they don't train manager in pay communications, which is probably why there are so many bad pay communications happening out there. And, we often say HR professionals, we don't trust our managers to talk about pay, but unless we empower them by training them, then, how can we trust them? But yeah, I've done a lot of manager training. I think Matt covered it really well. I always go with a 3-step approach of kind of acknowledge when an employee comes to you, share, and educate. So Matt kind of covered the share and educate. A lot of pay communication training that I've done is focused on the psychology of pay. And really, as a manager, you need to be aware of the whole sensitivity around pay, particularly when we're in the comp function. Pay is often just a number for us. We tend to move the people away from it because we're managing so many people's pay. But pay is really for many people a measure of their own self-worth. It's an expression of what they can achieve in their life and their livelihoods. So it is a very emotive topic. And, as Bill mentioned earlier, with rising cost of living, concerns about how we, will be able to maintain our standard of living, you can see why potentially employees are feeling, hey, I've got to do something about this. I need to understand, how I might progress my pay. So I think, giving managers some background to how employees might feel coming into those conversations, and then doing the stuff that Matt said, which is the educating, the Comp 101, because a lot of people, no matter how much information you might have put out across your company intranet, or how many communications you've sent about how comp is determined, not everybody's probably read that, and so they don't understand this is how we set your pay. These are the things we take into consideration. So just revisiting that with the employees so they can understand it. And I love the point, Matt, that you said about progressing your pay and what do I need to do. That, I think that's the best thing a manager can be prepared to do, rather than saying, oh, no, it's not the time to do pay increases now. Let's talk about how we might move to the place that you want to be in the future. And, this is what we would expect to see from you, and blah, 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 and it's just like making that a much more of a career development discussion than a kind of, simple pay discussion.
Exactly. I think that's, go ahead, Bill.
I was going to say, yeah, and both of those things that's it exactly. Is it's having the conversation and being in it together, and we're working together. It's not us against the employees or the employees against us. It's we're trying to get to the same place of you doing better, you earning more, us getting more out of you, us helping you get better at your job or get to the level of the next job. I think all of that is great, and I think. One thing that sort of, I think, left on the cutting room floor from what Ruth was saying, is like, I think there's a lot of people listening who don't have transparency with their managers, let alone their employees. And so the managers aren't educated to have the conversation with their employees because the managers have no idea, or, Ruth definitely said this, it's like, no one reads those things that we HR people put out. We write some really good documents, but nobody reads them. So nobody's understanding what's going on in many organizations, and making it easier, more digestible, and better understood by managers and employees alike is critical for people to understand what's going on, and to have faith in the system, because lack of knowledge creates distrust. And I think we think we're communicating a lot, and, the managers and definitely the employees think we're not communicating at all. So I think that's important to, the transparency issue and the confidence, the faith, and the willingness to, Matt's got it exactly right. The willingness to wait until the next review cycle, and here's the plan, and here's where I see your pay ending up. That's often good enough for people to feel like they're being heard and being respected, which is, the psychological side of the pay discussion.
Yeah. And one thing just occurred to me when we were all talking about how to have this conversation and the value of your comp practices, explaining the leveling and explaining against market. we didn't really talk about in detail is bringing internal equity into the conversation of value. In other words, in addition to the market, there's also we're this company, and we take it very seriously that our employees who do similar kinds of work are paid similarly. And so this is another part of our story. Maybe that's a good idea to bring up. Maybe it's not, depending on where the market is. But there is there value in sharing that holistic story? Like, Matt, have you found talking to your teams and if the company has a good practicing and internal leveling policy, is that a helpful conversation to have?
I think yes. If you have a good, the key thing there was the last point that you made, a good internal leveling process there, which I don't know. I'm speculating here, but the majority of customers of companies rather probably don't have that great of a process. It's tough to get to that point. But if you have a great leveling process, it makes these conversations a lot easier. I think, I've worked with organizations where we have a solid foundation for leveling, and it makes the conversation about what you need to do in order to get to this next level and get promoted. And we can point to 3, 4, 5 different abilities, skills, that sort of stuff that, they can work towards. Again, just giving them something to work towards, it makes that conversation a lot easier. So I think, yes, if you have a great foundation, good structure there for it, then I think it helps in these conversations. Legitimizes it even a little bit more about, what you need to do in order to get this increase, not just here's what the market's saying, or, you've been a good employee, you deserve this raise.
Well, I think also educating employees that you are going through a process of looking at equity across, the group. And I've done quite a few, PR interviews recently, which have all been focused on kind of know your worth and how to prepare women. It's been a lot of gender focused engagements, but how to prepare yourself for the pay conversation and how to ask for the most that you can possibly get. And I've been countering that to say, well, there's a difference between the most that you can get and what's the fair rate for the job. And that's all the conversation that we've had already about saying how we set a pay range, where you sit in that pay range based on the compensatable factors that you bring to the table. So I think, as managers, we need to be able to, make sure our managers are ready to have those conversations as well about equity, as well as kind of an individual person saying, like, I want a 50% raise, so. Russ, as my manager.
Yes, I heard that. I was just, what a coincidence. But I think there is something there maybe 10 or even 10 years ago, the mindset of most employees is simply, how do I maximize my own personal revenue? But I do think that's still there. Don't get me wrong. But I do think there is a bit of a shift towards, well, what is the socially responsible way to pay? And I don't want to take more than my share from others. And how do I make sure that that's going on? And I think there's an opportunity for companies to sort of talk about that a little bit too. So this has been a lot of great stuff in here, a lot of great insights. I'm taking notes for myself for my next conversation with Ruth. But really the sort of what we all kind of said though is like, hey, sort of lean into the fact that employee has done a little bit of research, right? Don't belittle the effort they've done. Don't belittle the data they have. Take a look at it yourself. You should have access to employee reported data, understand where employees think they should be, and be armed with that conversation to have that. Is that right? That's what I heard, I think, right? Like, don't be afraid of that data. Don't be disappointed they've done the research. You want someone who's motivated, right? You want someone who's full of energy. You want someone who has good self-esteem and wants to drive and has good grit. Those people are that way because they do things like their own research and understand what they do to be better, right? Any last thoughts on those last kind of closing comments I made there? I'll go to Bill.
I think you acknowledge their diligence, and sort of, that's a positive rate. It's positive. You make it clear that you're not scared of it, but you're, also, that's smart that you did that. Let's look at the data you have, use that as the starting point for a conversation. It's, disarming and comforting. And again, it's back to the collaborative as opposed to competitive or combative attitude between the parties, and this isn't like, when you're buying a house or a car, and you're, both sides are trying to, get the best deal and, sort of take advantage of the other side. This is more, we both win together, and we want to make sure that you do that. But just because they have, data does not necessarily equal fact, and data does not necessarily equal like a perfect piece of information. And in our world, I forget who said it. I just know it wasn't me, but I agree. There isn't a single right answer. There's no there's no hidden answer that says this job pays that amount of money in a given company. And so understanding that and sort of knowing there's art and science here is part of the conversation, and be open-minded with your employees, and be open to having them come in and have the conversation. Remember, like, as much as, we hate having some of these conversations, employees don't love being confrontational with their bosses either. So, if you take that pressure away, it makes them happier and they're more comfortable, and, they're more likely to stay just because you've listened, acknowledged, and educated them a little as to how you pay. So, do that and have that engaged conversation.
I think that's right. Matt, does that ring true to you? I mean, anything else you would share before we say goodbye today?
No, I think Ruth and Bill summed it up pretty well there. I don't know what else I would add there. I would say on the other end of the spectrum of what Bill was on, more to the positive side there. If you approach that situation as a manager negatively, the employee may just be coming to see if it's possible to get more money. They may not be out the door and really out there looking. The way you handle that, if you handle that poorly and you go on the negative side of things, that may be the nudge to send them somewhere else too.
Right.
So handling it together, working with them, educating them, understanding the research they did, educating them on, your side of things and how you need to work with budgets and timing and all of that sort of stuff. And whether market says, just because the market says this is the rate for this position doesn't necessarily mean the company is able to pay that today. And having a dialogue, working together, it could prevent someone from leaving, even if you don't get that increase done at that point.
Yep.
Okay. I'd have one more side twist, which, I think we've hit this theme a few times in recent podcasts and remember that not all employees or all jobs are equal. And, I remember having a client, which was, a very, 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 very large fast food company. And, their concern was if, the fast food place across the street raises their salary, 10 cents an hour, their employees are going to quit and go across the street. So at that level, there's a certain level, and it happens in many companies, where it really does make a difference. Like, small dollar amounts make a difference, and that is the motivating factor. And when an employee comes and tells you, that, the fast food place across the street, or the hotel, or, the delivery service is willing to pay me an extra 25 cents, $1 an hour, or, as we saw during COVID, an extra $5 an hour, the employees are gonna flee, and there's a domino effect. And so if somebody comes to you at that level and says there's a lot of opportunity somewhere for significantly more money, that could be a canary in the coal mine, and you may want to say, ring the alarm bell, go back to HR finance and say, we're about to have a problem.
Yeah,
keep that in mind.
Yeah. And my final thoughts. Before I do that, Ruth, any final thoughts from you on this? Because I know there's so many topics to talk about with this.
Yeah, I just think it's a good thing that employees are getting more confident about, seeking their own data sources. I think for too long the power has been in the hands of the employer. We've held all the cards. We've had the market data. We've done our market data surveys, and that's tends to be a very one-sided conversation. So I think it does just generally generate more debate, more fair pay conversations, by having these two sides have access to the data. And I think as HR folks, we need to be more understanding and embracing and understand the positive nature of crowdsourced or employee reported data as well.
Yeah, exactly. And quite frankly, as a manager myself, I'd much rather have the conversation. I'd much rather have an employee come to me and say, hey, love working here, love working for you. Company's great. Just been getting a feeling like maybe the market's moving a little on me. I did a little research and, can we talk about how I can get a pay increase? Much rather have that conversation than, hey, I didn't know how to tell you this, but 6 months ago, I started feeling like I was underpaid. So I hit the job market, polished up my resume. I got these 4 offers, 23 of them are 20% higher than you're going to, so I'm going to accept. And you're like, counteroffer, how do I deal with this, right? I'd much rather have the proactive conversation with an employee, as Matt said earlier, who is trying to stay and just feels like a little underappreciated compensation-wise, than you're making a counteroffer, which sends the message the only way to get an increase is to go get another job and have to get a counteroffer and, a whole other can of worms. That's probably no other podcast. So in any case, thanks everyone for all those great insights. And that's what we think about, how to handle that conversation with an employee that is coming to you doing their own market research. What do you think? Let us know. Either send us an email at coffee@payscale.com or send us a comment on Twitter over at Payscale. Thanks for listening to Comp and Coffee. Comp and Coffee is a Payscale production dedicated to the compensation community. We welcome your feedback. Send email to coffee@payscale.com, tweet us at Payscale, or share your thoughts in our Payscale Connect community. Until next time, keep your coffee hot and your data fresh.